on our way to the Disney Family Museum in San Francisco.
It's gonna be fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't know what to expect.
So welcome to our review of the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. This is over by the Presidio, I guess the area is called. So you have a great view of the Golden Gate Bridge, but also Alcatraz. But wanted to try something different. We were there, obviously, and it's a museum, so it's hard to film any kind of overviews. So we are doing this when we return back to Birmingham. So hopefully this works. So in this first gallery, the Early Beginnings Gallery, you really start to look at Walt's early beginnings. One of the cool things about the museum, it's super high tech, so you'll see a lot of screens all over the place. Noticeably in this gallery, you'll see that there are screens like the one right there, which are effectively telling a portion of the Walt Disney story. You see a lot of family photos, a lot of communication for family. You get to see the thing for Walt oversees the ambulance. This first room off of this main gallery was really predicated around Walt's attempts at the lavogram films while he was in, I believe it was Missouri or Kansas City. So pretty interesting all in all. One thing you'll know as you're going through this museum, you're just kind of struck with the amount of history that's been able to be told about Walt Disney, but also about his family and how he became who he was. This part's actually pretty cool. This is meant to be a train ride over to Hollywood, where you dropped right into the Alice cartoons as they're playing around the walls. You start to see some of the equipment, and then also some of the stories. You'll start to hear about some of the challenges. I think there's a really interesting letter on the wall here. If you read it, it talks about how Walt's got all these money troubles and whatnot when he lands in Hollywood. This next gallery really kind of highlights his early animation attempts. This one's got a little bit of Oswald, talks about the story there. Right in front of us, we can actually see that this is an interactive display, which is really around doing kind of sound effects inside of the cartoons themselves. But also we learned about Mickey Mouse in this section as well. There is actually a really cool wall in this part of the gallery, which is coming up. That actually I spent a lot of time looking at. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, but right there. So this is highlighting all of the various marketing things that Disney did with Mickey when he first came out. Pretty interesting to see how he lost control over some of the marketing and had to kind of fight to get that back, but pretty interesting stories all over. In this next gallery, we learned a lot about the process around making a cartoon, most notably the importance of the storyboard. As you can see right ahead of us, that's really a storyboard conversation. But also you really kind of highlight the silly symphonies was a big focus here, but also I think there was a whole thing around the Three Little Pigs and the notion that they were adding character or personality to the characters, which was apparently some innovation at that point in time. Interestingly, there was a section I thought actually was pretty interesting, really comparing the advancements from one cartoon, specifically the Ugly Duckling, where it had like an early version and then below it the revised version that they had made in the 30s, which really did highlight some of those big changes that you've seen in terms of how they've actually done things with music and stuff like that. Other components of there's an interactive display area where you actually heard some stories around the process by which they actually made the paint, as well as some of the more technical things that go into making the cartoons, which was actually pretty interesting as well. This gallery was a little bit dry, but still probably pretty important to the story of Disney. I think this is actually where he learned about his daughter coming into the world as well. So this next gallery was really focused on his efforts to make his move into movies, most notably Snow White. Extensive coverage of Snow White in this in terms of Walt's interaction with his animators, but again, the process. I think one of the elements here that was pretty interesting was to hear about how Walt was so specifically focused on quality that the budget went over, as well as the fact that, at that point in time, nobody else had really done the full-on movie for a cartoon thing. So lots of people in Hollywood were clearly rooting against him, and pretty interesting to kind of put the dots together in terms of how Walt was doing it. Hey, so right there, there's more of those interactive display things. They are literally throughout the museum. I mean, I can't say how high tech and pretty interesting this was. My wife and I, we sat down at one of those ones on the couch back there, and we actually kind of went through it. And it's pretty interesting. You can kind of talk about the different phases of production as well as the different roles of the production as well. So really interesting, again, with the interactivity of the museum itself. As you walk through this gallery, you start to see additional details around Walt and his successes, most notably the success of Snow White. Following that, he opened his Burbank studio, which was pretty interesting when you start to see how he laid it out and then the overall scope of that entire facility. Pretty inspirational. Gosh, if you think about where you work today, it'd be nice to kind of think about working in a place like that, but that's part of life, right? I think you start to see a little bit around Bambi as well as Pinocchio in this section. Yeah, there's Pinocchio. It talks about the steps in terms of, again, the animation process. I think on the wall, they'll show the little drawings and whatnot. So really interesting section as well. As you're walking through this museum, the one thing you're left with, it doesn't really feel like a traditional museum. Just you're surrounded by not only Disney things. So if you've been down to a one-man stream down at the Disney Hollywood Studios, this is effectively that on so many levels above it. It's unbelievable. There you get to see, again, the multi-plane camera, which I know is down at the one-man stream, but and actually that's pretty cool. That at the bottom of that camera is actually down inside of the gift shop, which is pretty neat. You also start to get exposed to some of the other things like Fantasia, and then also, you get into the strike, which is coming up around here. Now, if you know anything about Walt, you also hear about how important and how devastating that strike was to him. So there's an entire section that really focuses in on what role that played in not only how he trusted his employees, but how he ran his business candidly, and then focus on how he interacted with his employees going forward. So as a Disney fan, you probably know that Walt had some stress after the strike thing. So this section highlights some of his overseas activities. So most notably his trip down to South America, and the 3 Carboneros came out of that. And then also you get into this section right here, which is really one of my favorites, actually, and probably my most disappointing section, which was his engagement around World War II. All of his propaganda material and war material. If you've seen any of those Disney Vault videos, there's an entire series around some of the videos they made, whether they be training or I think there's even some manufacturing videos that they made to help train people as part of that war effort. So pretty interesting stuff. I was surprised to see that they did do some more risque photos or drawings. But nonetheless, I think it's pretty important that we highlight that Walt was engaged there. Again, I wish I would have done more there. It was a really small nook. I feel like it should have been more expanded, but nonetheless, still pretty cool. So I mentioned before, as we were walking through this, one of the things we were struck with was the technology that they've used in this museum to kind of highlight the story of Walt Disney. This room is probably the best example of that use of technology. Throughout the room, there are these touch screens, and my wife is playing with one there. And you can kind of touch on all the various components or movies that Walt had started to film after the war. It gives a little highlight around the story, but also it's just fun to be interactive with Walt Disney and the stuff that you probably are not necessarily most notably aware of. Above the top, there's this big gigantic screen that's playing different scenes from different movies. Again, it just goes to the caliber of this museum as far as being an engaging place to kind of get buried inside of the Walt Disney universe, but also feel close to Walt in terms of the story there. This is definitely a more mature area, I guess I would say. I can see where this would be a little bit rough on the kids. Actually, I think this museum would be pretty rough on the kids, to be honest with you. I think if you were probably less than 10, maybe 15 would be a tough spot to go. So just thoughts. So in this next section, as you're walking kind of outside of the high-tech room, you start to get into Walt's fascination with miniatures, which is pretty interesting. And then this section right here is really focused on Walt's move into more of the true life adventure things and the nature of things. Oh, there's the Golden Gate Bridge again, right outside the window. It's pretty neat. Great location. I gotta tell you, if you've never been to San Francisco, it's pretty chilly. So just keep that in mind if you visit. But this section really kind of talks about his live action, but also the stories around his true life adventures. This is actually pretty neat right here. So you're going to pan over and you're going to see a bench. The story here is that's one of the benches that Walt sat on when he decided to build Disneyland, which is actually pretty great placement because the next room is effectively the I think of the 50s where you see the model on the floor of Disneyland. So pretty interesting entry to that section. So by far, this is the best part of the museum, most engaging, most interesting from my standpoint. You know, if you've seen any of those classic movies with Walt Disney as in the, I think it was the 40s and 50s, he's got these trains. Well, here they are. I've always wondered where they went, but here they are inside this museum. And then an interesting thing, you'll see right here, there's a yellow caboose at the end of the train. This is actually the part that Walt actually took onto himself to build with his own hands. And there's, again, some stories here you can read about in terms of how he did it and, you know, his partnership, I think it was with Ward Kimball and his fascination with trains and stuff like that. Just all in all, really cool section. This gets into the Disneyland series. Talks about the different sequences, you know, Fantasyland, but by far this is the coolest part. So this is a miniature model of Disneyland, and the point here is that this is in Walt's time. So this isn't the current state or the original state, but rather the state it was when Walt was alive towards the end there. So you can see some of the things like the monorail, which were added later and stuff like that. I honestly could stand there and just look at this thing for a while. My wife was fascinated with this as well. It's just really cool to see all the intricate components that they put in place around, you know, the development as well as the designing of this model. I'm not sure if this is the original model. I certainly don't know. I didn't see a sign that said that, so it may be a recreation, but still nonetheless really cool to see. Another low shot as you can get down in there, and you can start to see right across Main Street USA, you know, Tomorrowland and stuff like that. I mean, really, this was just one of the coolest parts of the museum. Just the detail. I mean, just so much detail inside of this model. It was just unbelievable.
Much more comprehensive than I was expecting.
Now, again, we're transitioning into the television side of Disneyland, which again highlights the Tomorrowland series as well as some of the other components of the Disneyland story. They have this wall, and it's kind of on a rotation. Talks about and shows a little bit of videos from each one of the different series on a continuous loop. It was actually pretty interesting. My favorite one, obviously, is the Tomorrowland series. Again, I saw it on those Walt Disney things, but it had about the mission to Mars and stuff like that. Pretty interesting. So right here, this is really focused on going into some of the other intricate parts of it. There you see Abraham Lincoln. I think there was an example of the Carousel of Progress in here as well. And then you get into some of the other later movies that Walt was involved with, and most notably Mary Poppins. And really, I didn't catch any video of it, which I'm sorry about, but there's really this really cool interactive thing that talks about how they blended live action as well as the animation of some of the dance sequences with Dick Van Dyke and I think the penguins inside that movie, which is pretty cool. So this here is highlighting, when Walt announces Walt Disney World expansions. And gosh, if Epcot would have turned out like he had envisioned God only knows where we'd be. So as we wrap up our trip through the Disney Family Museum, you come to the somber part, which is the section by which they're remembering Walt Disney. It was interesting to see the number of drawings as well as some of the news reports that you kind of saw in this room that kind of highlighted the when Disney passed, the surprise that it had for a lot of people and then the sadness it caused around the world. Actually, it's pretty interesting to see how many people kind of had that outreach. So this kind of wraps up where we are for the museum. So all in all, the museum from our standpoint was just an incredible blast. Probably spent 2 to 3 hours. We probably could have spent another hour or two in this place. Again, I would think it's a little bit rough on kids, but if you're a Disney fan, it really is a cool place to see at any point. So, and as a DVC member, you do get a discount. So again, take advantage of that if you go out there. And I do think it's a must-see for any Disney aficionado or fan for that matter. So hopefully this was helpful and enjoy. But that concludes effectively our trip to the Disney Family Museum. So thanks for watching. And we'll finish here like all Disney activities in the gift shop.
We're actually about to hit 7 years here in 7 years. Yeah.
7 years, wow.
On October 1st of 2009.